Hi, this is Graham and I do hope everyone's having a great day. This is a video primer ahead of my next tutorial for the FZ200 camera, which will be on shooting video. I thought it worth spending some time looking at the process of encoding video so it can be stored on the SDHC memory card within the camera. In this simple diagram, I've tried to illustrate all the process stages of capturing an image and converting it into a file which can be stored on the card. We can see the lens images the subject onto the CMOS sensor. In between the lens and the CMOS sensor we have the aperture, and the aperture controls the amount of light falling on the sensor. We have an electronic shutter which also governs the amount of time that the sensor is exposed to light. The actual sensor itself contains an array of photosites or photodiodes. Each one of those photosites has its own inbuilt lens to collect and focus the light down onto the photodiode. In addition to that, each pixel has a primary colour filter, so some have a red filter, others a green, and the remainder blue. There are more green photosites on the sensor because it's far less sensitive to green light than it is red or blue. The actual arrangement of red, green and blue pixels differs from manufacturer to manufacturer, but the most common arrangement is called the Bayer filter. The actual photosite itself is an analogue device and responds logarithmically to the amount of light falling on it. We can't process analogue information, so we need to make that into a digital format. And the component that does that is called the analogue to digital converter, or ADC. Quite often the ADC is combined with the sensor onto one chip, and it's also referred to as the digital sensor. So the light which is varying in intensity on the sensor is converted to a varying digital signal. This digital signal could be recorded directly to the SDHC memory card, but the data is so large that we'd only get a few seconds worth of data on the memory card. In professional video cameras this is often the case, we do record the raw data. However, in consumer grade cameras we actually reduce this amount of data by what's called a codec. And codec stands for compression and decompression. In the camera it's normally a hardware device, but on our computers it's quite often a software algorithm. The codec is there to compress both the video data and the audio data and store it onto the card. The actual process of coding is quite complex and varies from codec to codec. Until recently, the most popular form of codec was the motion JPEG. And we're familiar with JPEG images as these are the still images we use from our camera. And motion JPEG was just an extension of this, so the actual video file is just a sequence of still images. For this reason it's very easy to edit, as every frame contains all the information from frame to frame. In the newer codecs this information isn't captured in the same way. For example, with the latest form of codec, which is the H.264, which is becoming very popular for distribution of video over the internet, the actual process contains I, P and B frames. The I frames contain all the video information for each frame, but these are only interspersed at fixed intervals throughout the video. The higher the number of I frames in the video, the higher the video quality, but the higher the file size. So it's a compromise between having an abundance of I frames and high quality versus file size. In between these I frames the processor does something very differently with processing the information. It looks for what's called spatial information, and spatial information are areas of equal tone. So for example the background behind me would be spatial information as it contains lots of equal tones, and it's the function of the codec to produce a stream of data and the instruction how the decoder should actually reassemble these pixels. The other function is to code what's called temporal information, and the temporal information are areas of the video which are static. So for example the cushion behind me is static in this video scene, and again the codec will produce a stream of data that the codec understands how to rebuild that pixel and structure. The other portion of the video is where I'm moving, and these are transferred into what are called B frames. And it's done by what's called predictable motion. So if I'm moving my head from side to side, the codec sees this as predictable motion and again can define a series of instructions how the codec will actually rebuild this video data. The codec needs some instruction from us as to how to encode this data. The first one would be the frame size, and normally for full HD we're talking of a frame size of 1920 by 1080. We then need to know the frame rate. The fluidity of the video motion depends on the frame rate, and the higher the frame rate, the smoother the video. So you notice that anything recorded in 50p is far superior with image movement than anything recorded at 25p. Cinematic users will be familiar with the fact that Blu-ray is recorded at 24p, and this is to emulate the film days. So again, some cameras have a 24p film mode to enable you to reproduce this effect. The next thing is the video bitrate, and the bitrate is defined as the amount of data that's transmitted between a fixed period of time, and the higher the bitrate, the higher the video quality. With the H.264 codec that the AVC format uses in this camera, and in full HD and progressive recording, we're talking of a video bitrate of 28 megabits per second. The other thing to consider is whether the file is interlaced or progressive. If we're looking at a progressive recording, the output from the sensor is taken from the bottom to the top of the sensor in most instances. This gives rise to an effect that if you are filming motion which is moving left to right, if you were to take a still frame, you will see that the bottom of the image is leaning backwards compared to the top of the image. And if you move the camera side to side, you will experience what's called the jello effect or the jelly effect. These can be overcome in the editing program by use of special filters. If we're shooting interlaced, then we get the possibility of artifacts between frames. So if we've got subjects that are moving, they could have moved position between the two interlaced fields, and you'll see these as a ghost. So for example, if you've got a seagull flapping his wings in the frame, you'll notice the ghost image of this seagull's wing between the two frames. Interlaced recording is great if you don't have any subject movement, or you want a smaller file size. For example, this video is being recorded in an interlaced format as there's not very much subject movement. So if you are struggling for space on your memory card, shoot in an interlaced format, otherwise shoot in progressive for the highest video quality. The other format that the camera can use is the MPEG-4 format. An MPEG-4 is again a compression system that uses I, B and P frames. With this compression system H.264 in the MPEG-4 format, we have only a 17 megabit per second video stream, so it doesn't contain as much information as the higher bitrate 28 megabits per second in the AVC H.264 codec. This is where it can become confusing for beginners to videography, the fact that the MP4 can be both a container and a codec. The container is really the wrapper or structure of the file format that's transferred to the PC. With H.264 in an MOV container, the MOV container is a QuickTime format and it's understood by most PCs. But not necessarily if you don't have all the codecs installed on your PC. The container can contain any codec, so it could have an AVI, a Windows HD or a H.264. And unless you've got that codec installed on your PC, when you come to try and play the MOV file, it won't be able to decode the instructions. For Apple iMac iMovie users, you've already experienced this in the fact that it won't play AVC HD format natively. You have to use a transcoder to convert that file into a native file that the iMovie will understand, more like a QuickTime file. There are ways to transcode this information by using a transcoder that you can get off the internet quite freely. Just search for free transcode files. The function of the transcode is much the same as in the decoder. It inflates the size of file so you have bigger files and the PC can digest these without having to decode the file structure. So we've seen we have a container which will contain the information required by the codec. So for example, there could be metadata from the camera, which is all the timecode information. We could have closed caption information or chapter points if the codec requires that. The codec is the hardware or software which compresses the information from the video sensor to give us a file on the SDHC card. and we talked about progressive and interlaced recording and the difference between them. So when it comes to the FZ200 video tutorial, you should now understand some of the terms that I might use in that video and be able to understand the difference between containers and codecs and progressive and interlaced recording. So hopefully that's demystified some of the processes in recording video. Here's a sample of footage taken with the FZ200 in interlaced format versus progressive format, and following that is some footage in MPEG-4 format, which is at the lower bitrate of 70 megabits per second, so you can see the difference in video quality. This is a sample of 50i video in AVC HD, shot in the manual movie mode, 1/60th of a second, f3.2, 100 ISO. This is a sample video in 50p AVC HD, shot in the manual movie mode. The exposure is a 60th of a second at f3.2 with ISO 100. This is sample video from the Panasonic Lumix FZ200 in the MP4 format and Full HD. So you can see the vertical resolution of the interlaced file is less than the progressive one. Thanks very much for watching, hope you did find that interesting, and of course if you don't subscribe to my channel, please consider doing so. So until then, thanks very much for watching, bye for now.